Welcome to the Stories with Traction podcast. I'm your host, Matt ZAUN. Thank you for joining us as we uncover how stories are one of the most important aspects of your business. We'll talk about struggles, victories, and how you can utilize strategic storytelling to inspire those around you to action. Enjoy this episode.
Traveling all around the country, I hear one main challenge from business leaders. Doesn't matter what state I'm in, what city I'm in, what industry I'm in. Every time we're talking about challenges, there's one challenge in particular that is scaring leaders right now, and that is how to win the talent war. Now, everyone listening knows that a lot of that has to do with company culture. So is there something wrong within your company culture? Is there something that you can do to create a better sense of belonging? And that's what we're going to focus on today, because today I am joined by RICARDO Gonzalez, who is the founder and CEO of Bilingual America, and he's the author of numerous books, some of which include the 6 stages of cultural mastery, the 6 stages of cultural sales, and one that we will focus on today, which is to belong or not to belong, which truly is the question. Welcome to the show, RICARDO.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure. It's an honor. Love your work. Love what you're doing. So
thank you. And I likewise, I love what you're doing as well, because I feel like people are tired. They're weary, they're more flustered and stressed than they've ever been. And I feel like there's been a major shift. Maybe you can say COVID did this because people had to face thinking about priorities more. But I feel like there's been this shift where there's a lot of people that have stepped back from their workplace and asked, do I truly belong? So I want to dive in. I want to talk about that. Now, when we dive in, I want to focus on a quote to kind of kick us off that you had mentioned that really spoke to me, and I want you to unpack it a little bit for us. You said the goal of our cultural relations should be endearment, not tolerance. What did you mean by that?
So for years in the whole diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, we've heard a couple of things. That we need to be culturally tolerant, that we need to be culturally sensitive. And it used to bother me because I'm like, tolerant, okay. That means we just kind of look at each other, grit our teeth at each other, and just somehow find a way to get along, or at least not fight with each other. To me, that's what tolerance is. We're just tolerating one another. I thought there has to be a better way. And obviously the greatest of these is love, right? And the ultimate expression of human engagement is love. And so what I chose is the word endearment. And I think that rather than cultural tolerance, we have to seek cultural endearment, which means we go through a process in our cultural relationships so that we can get to where we actually love one another, which doesn't mean we always agree with one another. I always use the example of people who are, they're married or have spouses. You don't always agree with your spouse, right? But because you love one another, you find common ground to make it work. And I think that we have to move beyond this idea that we're just putting up with each other and our differences to we love each other and we are endeared to one another, even if we have differences. And one of the things I like to say is that we're not divided because we disagree. We're divided because we're disagreeable. And we need to start coming at this from a different area, even in regards to cultural sensitivity. I always tell our clients, put away this idea of cultural sensitivity and start thinking in terms of cultural skill. Because it is a skill that can be developed in life and business. And the more skillful I become, the more effective I become in the management of my cultural relationships. And so if I'm a business person, a business leader, a CEO, a COO, CHRO, and my role in my business is really people, then I want people to be endeared to my company. I want our company to be endeared to that community. I want them to be endeared to me. I want to be endeared to them. So I like the word endearment. And it's a word that just means we care, right? In Spanish, for example, it's the word, it's like cariño, which means we have affection for one another. And I think we have to move past this idea that we have to agree with one another to love each other. And it takes a deal of maturity to do that. And there's obviously a process, and that's what's in the 6 stages of cultural mastery, is how do we get to endearment? Because endearment is stage 6. How do we get to that point of mutual love and endearment together? But I think it's important, and words matter, right?
Sure. So let me throw this out to you, and I want to see if you've experienced the same thing. So I feel, and you're free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there are a lot of companies out there that they utilize diversity, equity, and inclusion like checking a box. It's just another box to check off. And they really don't understand why they're doing it. They don't really understand the importance of it. And they don't really understand how it's going to add and enhance their company culture. Has that been what you've experienced as well? Or is that really not what's happening out, especially in corporate America?
Yeah, so it's a very complex matter. First of all, America is diverse. We don't need a diversity movement in America. We are a diverse country,
Sure.
right? We're a very multi-ethnic, multiracial country. Whether or not a particular company or industry reflects that or not, that's another matter. And that's also a matter of culture and what works for that organization. So I'll start off saying this. Most high-level leaders that I work with are fearful. They're fearful of making or committing a cultural mistake that could, in fact, get them canceled, or, we hear a lot about the cancel culture. And the cancel culture is actually not a culture by definition. It's not a culture. It is a movement. And I think it's important to understand that it's a movement, and it's a movement driven by a certain type of activism. But a lot of leaders are walking on eggshells. In other words, what do I say, or what can I say to whom, when, where, or how? And so that makes leaders fearful. It makes them reticent. It makes them unsure of themselves. And, we could just go on. We could take an hour just to give examples of leaders who have misstepped or misspoken, and who, frankly, have lost their businesses, or they've gone through a great deal of public shaming.
Sure.
And so everyone wants to avoid this. The way to avoid that is not to develop cultural sensitivity. The way to avoid that is to develop cultural skill. And so I think that what's happening with leaders is real. It's also a bit unfortunate, but it's something that can be, just like we learn how to type, right? Or
Sure.
we learn computer skills. We can learn cultural skills. And what's kind of driving resistance is some people feel forced into it, when what we should be looking at is, how do I have the greatest influence on the greatest amount of people for the greater good, right? And all of us as business leaders, that's what we want. How do we have greater influence on a greater number of people to create the greater good, right? And if we do that and we look at it that way, then we start kind of shedding off some of the negative things that we're feeling. But yeah, a lot of companies are kind of checking the box, and that's a start. The reason I wrote 6 Stages of Cultural Mastery is because we would have companies coming to us really specifically on strategies and tactics of working with the Hispanic workforce, on recruiting, hiring, safety matters, retention matters, social media things, working with Hispanics, which whether people realize it or not, but in America, the Hispanic population is the driver of the economy right now, and Latino entrepreneurship. So it's a huge matter for every company to understand deeply.
Sure.
And so what we would do is we would have companies that their leadership would come to us for training on how to properly work with the Hispanic workforce. And we would give them a deep understanding of strategies and tactics and cultural nuances and so on and so forth. And no matter how well-intentioned or well-meaning they were, they would still get out and they would kind of mess it up. And what I realized was they were just looking at it as tactical and strategic, but it wasn't coming from the heart. And so what really drove the actual writing of 6 Stages of Cultural Mastery was this: how do we get leaders to see it not just from the head, but also from the heart? And once we started doing that, leaders started to have much higher levels of success. Because when we apply strategies and tactics out of the proper mindset, out of the right emotion, then we're going to be much more successful than if we're just doing stuff because we have to do it, going back to your comment of checking the boxes, right?
Sure. So let's take a step back for a moment, because I know there are people listening to this where they still haven't grasped the head portion yet. So before we dive into the heart piece, let's briefly touch on that head piece and then dive into the heart. Just talking about it from a professional perspective, because you did paint quite a horrifying picture when you said, leaders are concerned that something that they say, they could be canceled, lose their business, lose their profession. I mean, that strikes a lot of fear into a lot of people. So let's talk about the upside of what belonging means. So you actually quote an article in your book, The Value of Belonging at Work. I just want to read this briefly just to paint the picture for people of how unbelievable important this is. It's an article published by the Harvard Business Review. It says, if workers feel like they belong, companies reap substantial bottom line benefits. High belonging was linked to a whopping 56% increase in job performance, a 50% drop in turnover risk, and a 75% reduction in sick days. That is astounding. So just to speak to creating a company culture of belonging, it can have an unbelievable impact on one's business. So aside from that article, what are some of the things that you have seen when a company shifts from going from more of a stale culture to a culture that actually creates a foundation of belonging?
So the upside is phenomenal, right? I'll cite another one. This just came out from Gallup as relates to associate engagement. The average percentage of associate engagement in the United States right now, according to Gallup, is 33%.
That's mind-boggling.
Right? It just came out. I just saw it today. But in companies where the cultures are aligned and people are aligned to the cultures, where people have this deep sense of belonging, and this is in the Gallup survey, 70% of the employees are engaged. So that's additional data on this. Here's my contention with belonging. Corporate is really great at creating policies, right? And yet belonging is something that is deeply personal. So in other words, what may make you feel like you belong in a place may actually repel another person. And so companies have to really think this through and how they're going to structure the organization in a way. And in the To Belong or Not to Belong book, it's divided into 3 sections, or it's actually, of course, it's playing off the Hamlet, to be or not to believe, right? And so the whole book is structured like a play. So there's Act 1, Act 2, and Act 3. Act 3 is corporate belonging. Act 1 is personal belonging, Act 2 is social belonging, and Act 3 is corporate belonging. In Act 3, under corporate belonging, I go into great detail as it relates to the huge gap between low context leaders who are results driven, who are gaining sense of achievement through individual accomplishment, who value change over tradition, and high context, typically minority associates who value relationships over results, who value tradition over change, and who get their sense of personal identity through the group, not individual accomplishment. So we have this huge gap between high context associates and low context leaders, and leaders are going to have to learn to bridge that gap.
Wow. Wow.
Okay.
That's powerful.
If they're going to be effective in the day we're living in. And by the way, the younger, the Gen Z and the Gen X, the millennials, right? They're much more high context than the boomers, for example. And that's why, like the baby boomers, which typically are the people in high level leadership, right now, you know, they talk about the millennials as being like, you know, they'll use words like, and these are not my words, Matt, right? Okay. But they'll use words like snowflake and whiners and all of that stuff. What they don't realize is they're really working with more high context people who need a higher level of relationship and purpose to be attracted to an organization, right? But if you're trying to lead high context people through low context strategies, you're going to fail.
100%. So I appreciate you really painting the picture from a professional perspective for us. I think it's really important for leaders to understand just the magnitude of what can happen for them professionally. But I want to go a little bit deeper with you, just aside from the professional benefits, which there are many, and I think we had spoke to that. But the idea of belonging is a deeply personal one. And you mentioned this in your book. And you bring up a conversation that you had with a gentleman by the name of Robert Keene.
Yes.
That really hit you, right? It really spoke to you. And basically, this individual mentioned to you about not truly fully belonging in different places. So I want you to unpack that for people listening, just to paint the picture for them of what it feels like to not truly feel like you fully belong anywhere.
So I've never felt personally like I belong anywhere. And there's a there's a great quote from Maya Angelou, who on belonging, she says this. She says, "You are only free when you realize you belong no place, you belong every place, no place at all. The price is high, the reward is great." It's a deep thought, but personally, I've never really felt like I belonged anywhere because of my bicultural heritage. My father is one of 27 children from the same father from the mountains of Puerto Rico. My mother was an orphan from the state of Kentucky. And with no disrespect whatsoever, because I don't see it this way, I am literally a Puerto Rican hillbilly, right? And so when I'm in Puerto Rico, which is really my preferred culture, my Spanish was my first language. It's the culture. It's what I love, right? I still am half American, right? So I don't fully belong there. But when I'm in the US, my last name is Gonzalez, and I don't fully fit the mainstream, right? And when I'm in Latin America, even though my Spanish is impeccable and I own a school that actually teaches Spanish as part of our with Bilingual America, we have a language division. I'm still not, I'm seen more as an American than I am, and I'm white, right? So that's on top of that. So I've never felt personally that I belong anywhere. I live most of the time in the Dominican Republic, and I'm very acutely aware of that. So anyways, Bob and I, you mentioned Robert Keene, who's a good friend. He wrote the shopping cart code for European banking system years ago, before you and I could get on the internet and purchase things.
Wow.
And he sold this code for millions of dollars, and he was still relatively young, and he retired, and he bought this house in Escazú, Costa Rica, about a 20,000 square foot house, a couple guest rooms, the whole thing, swimming pool, sauna, the whole things. And we had met in a conference, and we hit it off. And he says, why don't you come down to Costa Rica, bring your family. We will, I'll show you some things. This guy's he's genius. He's brilliant. One night I walked into his office at 2 a.m. and the guy's sitting there programming. I said, Bob, you're a multi-millionaire. Why are you doing this? He does that. People can't see this, but he takes his finger and puts it in his arm like an addict would put an injection in their arm, right? A drug. He said, this is my drug.
Wow.
And he said to me, just to take that further, he says, after I retired and I stopped working, he said, I was going crazy. He said, I would get on Upwork, which at the time I think was Elance. And he said, I would bid on the hardest programming jobs in the world for $5 an hour just to challenge myself. He said, and they had no idea that they had this world-class programmer. And he's a geek, right? And he looks at me, we're out at his pool, and I'm a social person. I love nightlife. I love being out. I love being with people. I love talking with people. That's kind of my laboratory, right? I just love being with all kinds of different people. And that's one of the ways that I use to learn. And Bob says to me, you and I have a lot in common. And I'm thinking, we have nothing in common, right? And I said, how so, Bob? And he says, I'm American. I was raised in Spain. My mother was an ambassador in Spain. I lived in Germany. He said, and neither one of us will ever belong in any place fully. And he was so right. I had struggled with this my whole life. And so a lot of bicultural people, okay? So bicultural can be someone who was born in the US, but their parents are from another country. It can be someone who was born in another country, but now they're living in another country. They now are forced to be bicultural, right? So the US has a lot of bicultural people, but so do other countries, right? There are bicultural people around the world. Bicultural people struggle with two things. They struggle with both identity and identification. Identity is, who do I believe I am? And identification is, who do other people believe I am? Okay. Now, what is so important about that as it relates to belonging? I will never feel like I belong somewhere unless I have a true sense of identity there, and unless other people at that place they identify me in a way that resonates with me. And so part of our job as leaders is to know people well enough so that we can help them align identity and identification. And I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I hope it's helpful for leaders to start thinking in these terms rather than thinking in terms of policy. Start thinking in terms of the person. Each individual person has a different sense of identity, has a different sense of identification, and that's what they're going to align to or not align to. And we have misnamed this, the Great Resignation, right? This is what we're calling this. We have misnamed it. We should have called it the Great Realignment.
For sure, for sure. So I this is very helpful. What I'm hearing you say is more than likely there's a lot more people out there than a lot of people in leadership positions think that feel the same way that you feel, not truly feeling like you belong fully in a particular place. Would you agree with that statement?
100%. 100%.
So what can a leader do when they are managing people, they're leading people that don't feel like their identity actually aligns with the culture that they're in? What would you recommend that they do? Where would they even start?
So first of all, let me take it a little bit deeper. In the section on social belonging, just to take it further beyond biculturals and these types of things, what about people, which in the United States, over 2 million people a year do this, what about people who have actually run away from home, and the place where they should have most felt like they belong, their home, they didn't want to be there?
Wow.
What about people, only 1 in 10 people who attempt to commit suicide actually commit suicide? What about people who have attempted to take their life and they didn't want to even belong on earth, and now they're in our employ, whether we know it or not? Okay. So how do you work with people who have never felt like they belong even in their family? What about people who went through divorce? Right. So there are so many different things that play into this beyond just being about culture. But to answer your question, there are two things that I think every company needs to consider doing. Number one, they have to develop a much greater and deeper understanding of macro and micro cultures. Okay. If a company does not have a very clear, very compelling macro culture, it will develop a great, especially a large company, it will develop a lot of micro cultures within the macro culture. The macro culture will be weak and the micro cultures will be strong. And for example, in many large companies, you have BRGs and ERGs, which are business resource groups and the employee resource groups, right? And these BRGs and ERGs are developed around the idea of bringing together people of affinity. So you may have a BRG or an ERG for Hispanics. You may have one for Blacks. You may have one for LGBTQ. You may have one for veterans. These are all microcultures within the macro. Does this make sense?
Absolutely.
So you can have affinity in the microcultures, but all of those people may not have affinity to the macro culture. And if the macro culture is weak, the overall organization is weak. I contend in a perfect world, we would have no need for the microcultures because our DNA would be that we would all be aligned under the macro culture. Now, that's a very difficult thing to do in today's world, especially given the track that we've been on. Okay.
Sure.
And so number one, I think organizational leaders have to understand how do they create a compelling and clear macro culture to which all people will align, which takes us to point number two, and that is what I call a culture statement. Companies have vision statements. They have vision statements, but they don't have culture statements. A culture statement is something that everyone in the organization should align to. That creates the macro. Okay. So what is a culture statement? When it's all redacted and edited and properly developed, it's a one-pager that goes on the company's walls, on the company website. It goes everywhere, right? But to get to what a culture statement is, we have to understand what culture is. Okay? Because the culture statement is going to help us understand what our culture is. So what is culture? Culture is the aggregate of 5 elements of any group of people. So if a group of people do not have these 5 things in place, this is why I said the cancel culture is not a culture. Okay? Because it's not technically a culture, it's a movement. Okay? A culture consists of 5 elements. Number 1, beliefs. Beliefs are the linchpin of every culture. They are the foundation of every culture. Okay. Number 2, values. Okay. So beliefs are what we think. Values are the things that are important to us. That's the second thing in every culture. And the third thing are norms. And that's the things that we expect of one another, how we behave together, how we conduct ourselves. The fourth thing is language. How do we speak with one another? Now, that may be English, Spanish, French, but it may be the types of ways that we speak with one another. It may be we don't raise our voice at one another. That could be part of our culture statement, right? It may be if we disagree, we speak respectfully with one another. We don't call each other names, right? So that can be part of the culture's language. And then the fifth thing of every culture has are symbols. Okay. Now, in a business, you have your logo and you have all of those things. Just think about a religious culture. You may have the cross, you may have the menorah, all of these different cultures have symbols. Okay. Clothing is a symbol within a culture. food is a symbol within a culture. So if you go to a cultural festival, right? So you go to your local Hispanic festival on Hispanic Heritage Month, for example, right? What you're going to mostly see are symbols. But you're not going to learn the deeper things about beliefs, values, and norms. And where do people have conflict? Cultural conflict sometimes happens over symbols, right? We can think of multiple examples of that. But most cultural conflict is over beliefs, values, and norms. Okay. So one of the things that I do with companies is help them to structure their culture statement. And then every new associate in their onboarding process aligns with that culture statement in the macro. And if they don't get hired.
Wow. Okay. So let's dive into this a little bit deeper, because I think this is invaluable for people to hear. So you challenge companies to create a culture statement based around these 5 things that you just mentioned. So beliefs, you mentioned foundations. What is it? What the leaders think, or is it what the entire body of the organization thinks?
It's what the body of people thinks. It's how people believe. Now, leadership can obviously create that movement, and especially if you have, I believe that. I take this back. We've all heard the term inclusiveness, right?
Sure.
And so in our world of 6 stages of cultural mastery, only stage 4 leaders will be naturally inclusive, which is excitement. Because only when I'm excited about our relationships will I want to really include you. Right.
For sure.
So how do I get to excitement? Well, stages 1, 2, and 3, right? Okay. But inclusiveness should be a natural thing, not a policy thing. But the only way to get to true inclusiveness is I'm excited about you. I'm excited about your contribution, and I'm excited about you being here, which is the only time I'm actually going to provide a meaningful seat at the table, to use that type of conversation piece. But I think that, yes, it's a culture is the expression of people. It's not just the expression of leadership. We look at leadership, you can look at leadership in a couple of different models. You can look at leadership as a hierarchical, up here's the boss, then the next level, here's the board, here's the CEO. And then the next level, you have the COO, CHRO, you have the CSO, you have the all those things. And then underneath that, you may have a vice president level. And underneath that, you have another level. And then eventually you get down to the workforce, right?
Sure.
That's very hierarchical. But there's another model of leadership that we teach, and that is that the leader is the central hub on the wheel. And especially when you're dealing with people who are very high context, very relational, that model actually works better and is more attractive to people than the hierarchical model. And it actually creates more movement, the wheel, thus the wheel, right?
Sure,
So leaders can view themselves as being at the top of the food chain, or leaders can view themselves as being the hub on the wheel that drives the wheel, right? But they are literally in the middle of the people, right? And so I think that we have to look at the way we structure leadership if we're going to get our cultures correct. And we have to think in terms of, okay, if I create this culture statement, if I create this macro culture that everyone is aligning to, now we have strength, okay? But this has to come from the people. It just can't come from a couple of people who are just hierarchically just pushing it down to everyone and saying, this is how we all believe. And we can do this through committees. We can do this through surveying. There are multiple ways to accomplish getting that data.
This is simplistic. I always push back on organizations. And this is what I personally say is I always recommend that companies do not focus on company core values, at least the words of those values. I always recommend they focus on company core stories that exemplify those behavioral values. This is really important because we think in pictures. So if you tell me one of your values, Ricardo, is putting the customer first, your picture of putting the customer first and my picture of putting the customer first could be 2 completely different pictures. We're going to paint the picture through story, right? We're going to paint the picture through a story that someone in the organization had an experience to prove to me what it means to put the customer first. So I think it's really important as companies create a company culture of storytelling that they're able to really pull these different experiences and how they attribute to those values. Then you had talked about norms. So this is what people in the organization expect. So from a norm perspective, this really speaks to the heart of the culture, correct? So if the culture is we're casual and we wear jeans, then that's what people expect, right? They don't expect to be in Armani suits. They expect to be in jeans. Is that what you mean by cultural norms?
I think it's probably a little deeper than that. Those are more symbolic gestures, parts of the culture. A norm may be punctuality.
Okay. So this is more behavioral then?
It's more behavioral in nature. A norm may be that, when we communicate with one another, we say thank you in an email and we don't just leave the email. So, just different cultures function in different ways. So, it can touch on everything that we do, the way we communicate with each other. So, there may be someone who, I know there are business leaders who, when they're in an email thread, they just answer back. They don't say thank you. They don't put their name, anything of that nature. And there are other people who every time they send an email, thank you, appreciate you. And it's just an expectation of behavior, the way people speak with each other, So I think you can't really separate any of these 5 elements from the other. They are all working off of each other and around each other. They go together. You can't have one without the other, because the beliefs will create the values, and the values will create the norms, and the norms will create the way we speak with one another. The symbols are going to be the outgrowth of all of those things. So they work together in any given culture, whatever that culture happens to be.
Sure.
And so I would be careful about making any type of separation of them and seeing them more as one kind of spherical movement, where they're playing off of each other.
Sure. That's a really good point. Let's dive into one more, just because I want people to truly understand what you mean by language. So you had mentioned how do we speak? So not necessarily a different language, but the language of our culture. And I want to talk about this because you had mentioned this earlier. You said sometimes there's environments where some people belong, but they feel that they belong, but their sense of belonging actually boxes out another person's belonging. I'm paraphrasing what you said. I think when I heard you say that, my immediate thought went to humor. So when I do a lot of workshops, one of the things that we really focus on is emotional perspectives. So different elements rooted in emotion. And one of the questions I always get when I'm talking about emotions is people ask, why isn't humor on here? So when I give my handout, they say, well, why isn't humor on here? And my response is, humor is not an emotion, right? Because people have humor on multiple emotions. You can have a situation where you're really angry, but while you're presenting that story, it's driving out humor. Or you can have a situation where you're really excited and it's driving out humor, and everyone views humor differently. So I think it's really important when people are thinking about language is, do you allow different elements of humor in your organization? Or are you building a culture where crude humor is acceptable? Because that could box out a lot of people. A lot of people might not feel like they belong, or they're being bullied because of insensitive humor and actually downright despicable humor in some instances, right? It depends on how out of alignment a culture gets. But it's amazing to me what's funny to some can be deeply offensive to others. So I want you to talk a little bit about that. Is that around the lines of what you meant when you talked about language?
Well, yes. It's part of it because, the culture we're living in today, there's a great deal of ethnic sensitivity. And, you can think back and just kind of think back to, we used to have blonde jokes, there were whole books on Polish jokes, right? I'm Puerto Rican background, and, I watch Seinfeld, and there's jokes about Puerto Ricans, And so what may be really funny to one group of people may actually wound another person.
Sure.
And so humor is something that even in public speaking, Matt, and I know, we have to be very, very careful with, because it not only, it may not be funny to some people, it may actually be downright a turnoff and offensive to other people, where we just lose them. And I think that, there's this balance between this desire to have free speech, but as leaders, our goal has to be to reach the maximum number of people. So if that means me moderating how I speak to a certain group of people, then that's just being wise.
Sure.
That's not acquiescing or, we throw a lot of terms around today, but to me, it's being wise. I may speak, if you and I were in a private conversation, you and I may speak with one another in one way that we maybe wouldn't speak with other people in that way, depending on our depth of relationship and what we know about each other. And so leaders need to be skilled, right? I typically advise people to avoid humor unless they really are sure that what they're saying would be universally accepted. I mean, we're not stand-up comics,
Sure.
right? And even stand-up comics today are really taking it on the chin as well. I mean, there's multiple examples of this right now, of different episodes in comedies that are not being accepted. And, Dave Chappelle might be a great example of this right now. I mean, and he may or may not care. That's not the point. The point is that a large group of people is taking offense to something that someone's saying. And there's no real room for that in corporate leadership at this point.
Sure. Yeah, so you bring up a really good point. And so I do a lot of coaching for different politicians, primarily debate prep, press conference preparation. And one of the things I always mention is stay away from trying to be funny, because a lot of politicians, they're not comedians, and they get themselves in deep trouble because they think, I'm going to build trust with my audience by throwing out this joke. And in reality, they actually put up walls and they're creating barriers, because what's funny to some is not necessarily funny to other people. And the same goes for CEOs and executives. Sometimes
Absolutely.
they may say a joke that they think's funny, and it might be funny to 60% of that organization, but 40% of that organization is going to be repulsed by it. I'll also mention, just to kind of give this a little bit of credibility, I have 5 years of training in improv comedy. So I've done major extensive work in comedy. The reason for that is there's a psychological element to humor, and I did it regarding stage dynamics. So if you're really good at improv comedy, you can really dominate and master a stage. So I did it for numerous reasons. But I say that because for everyone listening, that you've listened to my podcast, you would never peg me as the funniest person you've heard, because I'm very reserved in my humor, and I do everything I can from, I need to make sure that it's going to fit the mold with who I'm talking with. So I mentioned that right out of the gate, because it's really important that even if you have extensive training when it comes to what's funny and what's not funny, sometimes the best thing to do is still be reserved, so you're not alienating or offending people. So I think that's important for me to say.
No, I think it's great. And I think beyond that, if people are going to use humor, then they should address it more towards themselves. For example, when I say I'm a Puerto Rican hillbilly, right? That's towards myself. It brings a laugh. Never fails to bring a laugh, because it's different. It's funny, right? But I buffer, because like in Puerto Rico, the hillbilly, or the jibaro, which is what we say in Spanish, is probably the most revered figure in Puerto Rican folklore, right? And so it's a positive term. Even in the United States, sometimes people use hillbilly as a negative, but for me, it's a positive. So I'll typically buffer that. So if you're going to use that type of humor, make sure it's more on yourself.
Absolutely.
Right? Not about other people. And then also, if you need to buffer, I think buffering is an incredibly important skill for speakers and for corporate leaders, that if we're going to say something that we know is perhaps going to be difficult to take or to assimilate, or is going to be difficult to understand, or potentially controversial, learn to buffer those statements before making them, and prepare people that
Sure.
I know that what I'm going to say could be taken, but this is what I mean. So please hear me out, right? And there are
Sure.
multiple ways to buffer, but I think the skill of buffering for leaders is very, very important, especially in the storytelling process, if you're going to go into the realm of humor.
Absolutely. Well said. Well said. So we unpacked a lot. We dove into a lot of different elements, and I very much appreciate this conversation. So before we wrap up and close, I just want to go through different things that I personally learned that spoke to me the most, because I think that there's a lot to be said here, but I got a lot out of this conversation. You talked about going from sensitivity to skill. You had mentioned the difference between going from head to heart. We had talked about macro and micro cultures. You had mentioned the challenge of companies having a culture statement. That's an awesome challenge. Everyone listening to this, I think that's a really good action step to take, is to sit down and start thinking about having a culture statement. Everyone should align to that culture statement. I think that that's really important that you had said that. Then you mentioned beliefs, values, norms, language, and symbols. So I really appreciate just all the different things that you brought to the table with this conversation, Ricardo. I think it was absolutely invaluable. For anyone listening that wants to get more information on you or what you do, where's the best way that they can connect with you and get more information?
For my books, ricardogonzalez.com/books. For me, just ricardogonzalez.com. Okay.
Perfect. Awesome.
That'd be the easiest way. Yeah. So
and to make it even easier for people, I will include that in the show notes. They can just click and go from there. And I really appreciate what you do. I've had the opportunity to read a lot of the things that you put out there. I've learned a ton. It's going to help me be a better leader and better communicator. So I personally appreciate that. I know that you offered a ton of value to people listening. So thank you.
I appreciate it very much, Matt. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you have a story that you would like to share, feel free to drop an email to matt@mattzaun.com with the subject line Stories with Traction. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share tons of resources on how you can be a better storyteller. Remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.